Hey, Lance Egan here with Fly Fish Food with Skill Builder number 7, Siete. Today we're going to cover indicators, line to leader connections, and ways to attach multiple fly rigs. Check it out.
That's a big
Alright, first up today, let's talk about strike indicators or bobbers or suspension devices or heathen gear or whatever you want to call them. They are often maligned, but they are kind of an integral part of fishing flies subsurface. We can fish very imitative patterns below indicators. We can fish attractors below indicators. We can fish leeches and chronomids in a lake below indicators. Whether or not you think that's real fly fishing, honestly, I don't care. If you don't like indicators, you can hang up now. You can turn it off, find the next video. Or you could listen in and maybe learn a new way to catch some fish. If you like indicators, then you're going to find out that there are lots of them available and there are lots of attachment methods and ways to use them. So let's dive right in with these. First up, I want to cover attachment styles, so kind of groups of indicators. So I have a thingamabobber, foam that we call octopus indicators, yarn indicators of various sizes and colors, and the telestrike from Rainey's. All of these attach with kind of the same type of method, which is you take a loop of your leader, anywhere on your leader, you create a loop like so, and you simply pass the loop through the opening, either through the opening of the O-ring or the opening of the thingamabobber. Then you open it up, you pass the indicator through the loop, and you simply cinch it up, and you have attached your strike indicator. They're really easy to attach. That attachment method is not the easiest to slide. It's often best to just remove them and then move them up or down your leader, as the case may be, to move them closer or farther away from your flies. But all of these, same thing. Loop through the center, I missed through the center, over the top. Pretty simple. I think you all can figure that one out. Really, really easy. The telestrike from Rainey's is a little bit of a unique one because you can do that. You can create a very tiny loop and pass it through this little eye here, kind of like a little mini tippet ring. Another way you can use this style, since this is kind of a hybrid, is you can actually tie like a butt section to that little, I don't know how well you can see that. Let me see if I can get it on top of that. There, you can see it a little bit better. There's a tiny little ring. Think of like the eye of a hook on the end of this. You could tie like a 10 or 15 or even 20-pound butt material to one side of it, and then on the other side of it tie straight 4x, 3x, 6x, 5x, whatever you want to do, straight down to your nymphs. The advantage there is the floating portion of your leader and your indicator are up high, and then extending through the water column, you don't have any thick butt section. You just have very, very thin diameter material heading down through the water column below the indicator. The other cool thing about this particular style is they have that little indicator that stands upright when you're getting a nice drift and it's sitting upright. So that attachment style is more loop, very easy to use. The most popular of which that we sell are the thingamabobbers, followed by any of the yarn style of indicators. All right, next up we have kind of the Oros slash airlock, center lock style that has a groove of some sort in them. In the case of the Oros, in the center. The airlocks here in the original of this style has it on the end, but just a little groove where you would then take your leader material and pass it into the groove like that, and then simply attach this little piece back on here. These are much easier to slide than the other style because once they're on, but when you want to move it around, you just loosen that up and it will slide up and down the leader with ease, and then you just tighten it back up. So that style is very simple. The Oros works the same, except that it's in the center of it. You stick the leader in the little groove. You can hopefully see that on there a little bit. There you go. That's an easy one. And the center lock is also the same from Airlock. It has grooves in the center, has a larger diameter, smaller diameter, or not really diameter, smaller width and larger width grooves. Lots of cool things you can do with those. These are very buoyant. They hold up lots of weight. They do splash the water a bit harder than, say, the yarn style of indicators. The other attachment style is what we call a slip indicator or a slip strike indicator. These are most popular for still water fishing, and for me, I use them mostly when I'm fishing very deep. So in a scenario where you might be fishing let's see, say 8, 9, 10 feet or deeper. If you're fishing shallower than that, you can get away with any of these other indicators. But if you're going to fish still water and you want to fish chronomids or a leech or something like that, and you want it to be down 12, 15, even 20 feet, you can't attach any of these other leader or any of these other indicators up your leader far enough to get that depth and then land the fish, because your indicator will get stripped right into where it gets to that first rod guide, and that fish is still out there 10, 15 feet away, and it eliminates the ability for you to net that fish. So that's not an option. So what we're going to do with this style that's a little different than the rest is, first of all, you have to attach it before you put flies or weights or anything else on. We're simply going to pass leader through this little post here. This post is hollow, has a little hole in it, and through the indicator, or else it's going to run away on me here. You slide that down the line to whatever depth you want. Then you simply pull the little plug out, this little black cylinder. You catch a loop of leader like that, pull it down a little bit, then jam it in place. Now it stays put. It's not going to move. You can see it's not sliding up and down. It will stay in place until, again, this can be up 15 or 20 feet, until your nymphs are down deep or your balance leech is down deep and a fish pulls on the bottom and you set the hook to tighten the rig up, and then it slides down your line. It will now slide back and forth and slide down either to your top fly or to some sort of stopper knot that you've got in place there. So this style is not very common in rivers. It can be used in rivers, but it's most popular on still water where you want to fish deeper, again, than say 8 to 10 feet. A very popular style. We do carry these in lots of colors and different sizes and so on. More of the slip strike, kind of a pop loose type of indicator. That's the main attachment differences. The other thing I want to talk about real quick is cider material, which is not technically an indicator as far as a suspension device goes. It's more of a visual indicator, but all of these materials come in various color combinations, some two-tone, some of them three-tone, some with little black sections. This one's got white, yellow, and kind of the reddish orange all in one. There are several different brands of these. And although it's not a traditional strike indicator per se, it is a type of visual indicator that we use only when Euro nymphing. So these are not generally used to hold nymphs up like traditional strike indicators, but it is a way when you're Euro nymphing, it is a very common way to detect strikes. So I wanted to include it in here just briefly. All right, some applications for some of these. So obviously, working backwards, the cider material more limited to just Euro nymphing. The Oros or airlock or center lock style, more nymph fishing in rivers or lakes. These are buoyant enough to hold up, a bounce rig or several split shot or pretty heavy flies. The slip strike, more still water type application, and then all these other loop style attachments, generally speaking, more river application. The bigger the yarn, the bigger the foam, the more weight they'll hold up. The smaller they are, of course, the less weight they hold up. So keep that in mind as you're getting ready to fish and as you are building your rig for each day. You don't need an indicator this large if you're just fishing a couple of little bead-headed nymphs. However, if you're fishing 4 BB split shot plus a couple of nymphs, you probably want something that buoyant, something that holds up a lot of weight. On the flip side, if you're fishing like a little zebra midge and an emerger and no weight other than just a little bead head on one of those flies, a really small yarn indicator works really, really well, or even a little pulsa indicator. This is just a sticky style. This one's actually from Fulling Mill. We also carry this style that's from Pulsa that basically has an adhesive on one side, and you just decide where you want it on your leader and simply fold it over the top and it just sticks in place. They don't slide, but they're good to fish for emergers. I also use them sometimes when I'm carp fishing. When I want a really delicate indicator that doesn't hit the water hard, they're just foam. Easy way to find your fly and detect strikes. People use these a lot with small dry flies also. You can cut them down if you want to, make them a little smaller, cut them in half. People use them with emergers, just one other style of indicator. As far as closing down this section, I just want to encourage you to think about what you're going to do when you're nymph fishing. Are you fishing a lot of weight? Are you fishing a little bit of weight? I would encourage you to go as small as you can, indicator-wise. Don't go really big if you don't need the extra buoyancy. This just hits the water harder than, say, a smaller indicator. Same here. Why go this size if that size will hold up enough weight? On the flip side, you don't want your indicator diving below the surface all day long with the amount of weight you have, so it's kind of a balancing act. But keep in mind, the indicator hitting the water very often does and certainly can scare fish, so you want to eliminate that as much as possible. You want to get away with the smallest indicator possible and still suspend or stay in contact with your flies to the best of that indicator's ability. So with that in mind, hopefully we shared a couple of tips about different types of indicators, when you could use them, how you would use them, and why you might need to carry a few different styles in your kit. All right, the next skill we want to conquer today is how to attach leaders to fly line. This seems like it should be very simple, and it certainly can be, but there are lots and lots of ways to do this, and I want to kind of work through a little bit about the history of fly lines, modern history anyway of fly lines, and briefly, and then talk about some of the pros and cons of different styles of attaching leaders to fly lines, and then maybe make some suggestions to help your connections get a little smoother. So to start out, let's talk just real quick basic history of fly lines. So if you went back, let's say even 20 years ago, maybe even 15 years ago in many cases, depending on the brand you're talking about, fly lines did not have these little loop-to-loop connections. They didn't have a little welded loop on the end of them. They were just blunt. They would look more like this other end here. So if you wanted to attach a fly line to a leader, you had to either nail knot it, Albright it, you had to create a loop in the leader, you had to buy one of those little connectors that look like a little piece of rice that slid, a bit of the fly line slid through there, you tied a knot in it, pulled it tight, and then you stuck a bit of the leader through it, tied it on it, pulled it tight. There were all kinds of little ways you could make or buy braided loops that would slide over the end of the blunt end of the line, and then you'd have kind of a finger trap style attachment to a loop on the end. There were lots of ways to attach leaders, but as more modern fly lines have progressed and evolved, basically every line on the market now, with very few exceptions, now comes with a little welded loop on the end, and many lines even on the backing end of things. But really in this, we want to just talk about attaching your leader more so than your backing. So with that in mind, knowing that they didn't always have loops, I guess, is important, because there were lots of connections that were developed when we didn't have loops available to us, and many of those we'll show you here today. So now that we know a little bit about loops and why they're available, I guess to me why they are available is strictly convenience. Loops are the easiest way to attach a leader to your line. That's the most common way right here. You have a loop on the end of a fly line plus a perfection loop in a leader material, and you simply do a loop-to-loop connection that looks something like that. Very straightforward, very simple. It's easy to do. It doesn't take a lot of practice like something like a nail knot would. However, I want to talk a little bit about the pros and cons of these loops. If you've paid attention to this channel, you probably already know that I despise these things. It's the first thing I cut off of every fly line I buy these days. That said, if you're not very handy at knots, they are a very easy connection. So I wouldn't suggest cutting them off for everybody. There is a time and place for some people really love the loops. For me, I don't like them. The reason I don't like them is I don't like loop-to-loop connections in my guides. When you fish a leader that's long enough to get the leader inside the rod rings, when you get to land a fish, this is a point that's going to hang up in the guides, and it's going to cost you some fish. If you've ever spent time trying to get the line to leader connection in and out of your guides so you can keep fishing the rest of the day, you feel my pain. In certain rigging techniques, like really long stillwater leaders, or in Euro nymphing, where we have a fly line to leader connection that goes in and out of the guides on nearly every cast, having a loop is certainly not an option on a Euro rig, only because this is so bulky it's going to hang up and it will drive you absolutely bonkers. When I used to guide, when I'd have clients show up with a loop-to-loop connection, the first thing I'd tell them is we're either cutting that off and changing their connection, or we're going to use my reel, because I'm not going to watch them struggle with this all day long going in and out of the guides. So again, the pro for the loop is just ease, simplicity. The con is that it goes in and out of the guides like a train wreck. It's terrible. We don't like that. The other pro with a loop is that it does increase the surface area a bit on the tip, so it can aid a tiny bit in flotation, but I don't find that makes much difference at all. For me, it's mostly a con just for the guides, the sake that it's not going in and out of the guides. Again, the plus, it's easy to attach. So that's the most common way to attach a loop. Another way is to just tie leader right to it. This is just like a 3 or 4 turn clinch knot, just tied right to the end of the loop. While this is actually a little cleaner, it goes in and out of the guides better than this other style, it does deteriorate your loop faster because you're tying right to the end of that little loop, so it'll cut through the coating of the fly line and get you into the core quicker. So it's not as long lasting, but it is a bit smoother. Even this style, as you've probably found, after you change leaders numerous times, the leaders start to cut into the little finish of the fly line, or where this doubled line ends, the loop starts to crack right there because it's a different stiffness where it's doubled versus where it's not doubled. So you have troubles with them either way. Eventually you're going to have to cut them off and think of a different attachment method. Before I move on to the other attachment methods, I want to show you real quick the wrong way to do a loop-to-loop connection. We see these all the time. When you see people talking on internet forums, on Facebook and Instagram about how loops hinge, this is probably what they mean, because this is an improperly connected loop. All that was different on this is, instead of the proper way to do this, which is you take the loop on the end of your leader and you pass it over the top of the fly line and then run the leader back through the fly line. This is the right way to do it. You end up with kind of a figure of 8 like that. The wrong way to do it is to put this through the fly line loop, the mono loop through the fly line, and then this back through the mono, and then it ends up with this kind of conglomeration here, if I get this knot to pass through here, which is what we had on this other one where it hinges and it looks crazy. It's terrible. That certainly is going to be a hinge point, and it's not linked up. It's even more bulky than the standard loop-to-loop connection. That's not the way to do it. So remember, when you're attaching loops, you don't want them to look like this. If it kind of looks like a right angle, you got a 90 degree in there, that's terrible. You want it to be pretty straight. Don't connect it this way. Connect it by putting the mono over the fly line like this, then the leader back through the fly line, and it will be a much smoother connection, relatively speaking. All right. That's the right way to do a loop. So now that we've covered loops, let's get away from loops a bit, or maybe do a hybrid. The next one is an Albright. This is another way to connect a fly line to a leader. The fly line is actually looped around and doubled. It's not quite as bulky as a standard loop, as you can see, but it's still not very smooth. It has a bit of a bump here at the end. It is a better connection, I think, than the loop-to-loop connection. It's quite robust. It's a very strong connection. A lot of times we use this with wire, the same knot with wire leaders and things like that when you're connecting wire down, bite tippet to the end of your leader. But this is a way to connect a fly line to leader that is quite strong. It's not my absolute favorite because it doesn't go through the guides as well as I would like. The next up is a super glue splice. This is the smoothest for sure. Just for contrast, you can see how much thinner it is than the Albright. Certainly significantly more smooth than the bulkiness of 2 loops together. This is going to pass in and out of the guides, the smoothest of all these connections. It's seamless. The problem with these for me is that every once in a while, you give them a nice pull, you hook a big snag, you hook a log with a streamer and heavy tippet, and your whole leader disappears from here down because they fail once in a while. Not, if you do them right, not very often, but they do fail. They're also hard to do. You got to carry super glue with you on the stream. So it's not my favorite connection, but it is the smoothest connection. Super glue splice, you could find ways to do that online. Next up, we have just a standard nail knot, a pretty smooth connection actually. There again, contrasting it to the double loop, the loop-to-loop connection. This is a pretty smooth connection, especially when well tied. It does go in and out of the guides pretty well. That's the old standby. It works on just about every line. Mono cores, braided multi-filament cores, all kinds of things. Low stretch cores, it usually works on works well on also. but that's kind of your standard knot. That's what we often use to attach backing to the blunt end of a fly line as well. That's the old reliable. And then if we take that one step further, this is my favorite, most reliable connection, the needle nail knot. So you go through the center of the line first and then tie a nail knot behind it. So you can see it's still got the same nail knot, but it just ramps up, it kind of tapers from just monofilament to monofilament plus the fly line to the knot and then back to the fly line. That slides in and out of the guides very, very well, almost as well as this super glue splice, but because it has a little bit of a bump where the knot is, not quite as smooth, but for me much more reliable. These just don't break as often. So if you're going to attach with one of these other methods, then you either need to plan on changing them often, right? Or what I like to do is you add a butt section to it. So on most of my rods, I end up tying a semi-permanent butt section, quite a bit longer than this. I shorten these just for the camera, but I would tie a nail knot in a material that is a diameter that meets or exceeds the butt diameter of most of the tapered leaders I'm going to use on it. So in most cases, 21, 22, 23, maybe 24 thousandths of an inch. In pound test, you're usually in the neighborhood of 30 to 40 pound test. Believe it or not, that's what about the butt diameter of most tapered leaders, like 3x, 4x, 5x tapered leaders, usually are around 21, 22 thousandths, sometimes even 23, 24 thousandths. So what you don't want to have is a fly line that has a particular amount of stiffness, a butt section that has a similar stiffness, and then a really weak leader butt, or worse yet, a pretty stiff fly line, a really limp butt section, and then a really stiff butt. It will hinge there. So you want something that kind of transfers energy pretty well from fly line to leader butt. Then once you've connected this on here, what I do is I leave these around 18 inches, 20 inches or so, and then I just simply blood knot to the butt section fresh leaders. So that way I can tie a whole bunch of different tapered leaders on here without having to change this connection here. I love this connection because it goes in and out of the guides very well. It's very reliable. The disadvantage to it is it's much harder to tie. There are videos on how to do it online. It's one of those knots where you'll probably have to sit down for 2 or 3 hours and really work at it to get it very clean. And then by the time you need to do it again, you'll have forgotten, so you'll need to polish up on it again. It is a little more tricky to do, but I think it's the best connection. It's what I use on any of my fly lines that I can get through the center of the core. So you can't do it on mono cores, on low stretch cores that aren't hollow. It doesn't work, but most braided multi-filament cores, it goes right through the needle, that is, goes right through the center, and it's an easy connection. What else? That's really it, I think, on leader to line connections. There are lots of options. If I were making suggestions, I would tell you to do a needle nail or maybe a super glue splice. Any of those are green. That's giving you the green light. You got to do those. These are orange. They are not so good. That's a terrible way for sure. Don't do the wrong loop-to-loop connection. The Albright's okay, or a standard loop-to-loop connection. We won't call them red. They're not. It's not a stoplight, but it's somewhere between green and red. They're not ideal. They will work. They are more convenient, but not the best fishing option. So with that in mind, let's shut this one down. Hopefully we answered some questions. Hopefully we gave you something to think about. And maybe if you have more questions, hit us up in the comments or stop by the shop, and we can help you work through any of these line to leader attachments. To finish off this week's skill builder, we want to walk through how to tie and fish multiple fly rigs. So this is all inclusive. We're going to work through some dries, some nymphs, some streamers, and also stay tuned at the end. I want to show you how I tie a triple surgeon's knot and which end of the triple surgeons to use as your tag. I want to show you how to tie that, as well as I want to show you a quick tippet ring hack. So stay tuned to the end, but let's jump right in here. Let's start on the surface and work our way down. So first off, obviously fishing a single dry fly, you don't need any of these systems. You just tie it at the end of your leader. Straightforward, really easy. If you wanted to fish multiple dry flies, two or three dry flies, the most common way to do that is to tie them eye to bend. My favorite way to do it though is on droppers. So like this, I've got, if this hand here is the end of your tapered leader, I've got fly number 1. You can see that kind of connected to a tag end. So it's a triple surgeon's knot to a tag. Then I've got some space. And I've got a tag again to my second fly, and then the third fly is just on the terminal end, no tag needed. So this is abbreviated lengthwise between these flies for the sake of fitting them into the camera frame. Normally I would fish these no less than 3 feet apart, most of the time 4 or 5 feet between each of these 3 flies. You can't fish 3 flies everywhere, so check your regulations, your local laws to make sure. Most places you can fish 2, some limit you to 1, in which case you don't need to know any of this information. However, this is the best way to fish multiple flies, and the reason for that is the fish can get at this fly much easier. It has a single attachment point. It doesn't have line and leader in your way on both the front and the back of that system. So like when I fish still water with multiple flies, this is how I'm doing it. Dry on a tag, dry on a tag, dry on the terminal end. You could also fish dry on a tag, and a nymph on the terminal end. Dry, dry, dropper. Or dry, dropper, dropper. So you could have a single dry and 2 nymphs. Pretty straightforward, just triple surgeon's knots for those tags. All right, another dry fly method. Let's go the most common one. Just connecting leader straight to your tippet, right to your dry fly, and then tying right to the bend of the hook. A clinch knot or a uni knot or whatever knot you use to tie to the bend of the hook will work right here. Any knot that you would tie, I should say, to the eye of the hook normally. Just pretend that this is closed off and it's just a large eye of the hook. Whatever knot you use to tie your flies on will work to that bend of the hook. Then you drop down to your little beadhead nymph here, or again you could fish 2 dries this way. This works really well with a dry dropper when you're just fishing something singular behind it, especially if you're not expecting very many eats to come on the dry, most of them to come on the dropper. Then your dry fly works kind of more as a strike indicator. This particular tie-in method allows the dry fly to sit usually a little more flushed into the water and float right. However, the disadvantage to it is if fish are going to eat the dry quite often, they can run into the tippet. When you have tippet in the butt of the fly and at the eye of the fly, the fish have to come from the perfect angle to get a hold of it. Otherwise, they run into tippet in the front, tippet in the back, and they can miss the fly very often when you have it tied in both eye and bend. That is, however, the most common way to fish a dry and a dropper. It certainly works. It does catch fish. Just has that one limitation. The next option is eye to eye. Let's do this one right here. So both tippets basically are tied into the eye of the hook, nothing on the bend of the hook. This does allow fish to get to the back end of the hook, and since you're usually fishing it if the current's going this direction, the rig would usually land like this. The fly does tend, the nymph tends to be down here, so it can still get in the way of that fish. If you're fishing downstream, like you're fishing from a drifting boat or something, and you're drifting it to where you're upstream of the rig and the fish are getting at it from downstream, they get a pretty clear, easy look at that one. If you're wade fishing and mostly fishing back upstream, it's a little different on that. But same thing applies, just a clinch knot or a uni knot or 16-20 or whatever knot you like to tie to the eye of your hook. You just do it twice, one to your tippet to your dry and one to your dropper. You could also fish a dry fly in place of that nymph. One of my favorites, the dropper rig for a dry and a dropper. So again, we've got the nymph down below, we've got the dry on a tag. This works really well. I especially like this with caddis and things where you can have a nymph that's heavy enough to anchor it and bounce the caddis. We talk about this technique a bit in our Modern Nymphing Masterclass. If you check that out, modernnymphingmasterclass.com, it will show you that bouncing the caddis technique, deadly in some situations. The disadvantage here is that sometimes when you're fishing that rig, when the fish are eating the nymph a ton, this can be separate, can be floating away from the main line a bit, so it's not quite as sensitive. The other thing that can happen is if the nymph is pretty heavy, this dry fly, instead of landing like it should, like this, it will sometimes sit up on its head a little bit more because that's where the weight of the nymph is pulling. Advantages of this system, though, again, the fish can get at that fly with just about any angle except for straight in front of it. Any side or from behind, that one gets eaten really, really well. Tag end, dry dropper. Okay, moving a little bit deeper, we have some nymphing rigs. things like a bounce rig. So in this case, we have split shot on the bottom down here. You can tie a knot in the end of this. You can leave it long and just pinch this shot on very tight, hoping that it doesn't slide off. That way, if it gets hung up, sometimes that will slide away and you won't lose your flies. But the flies on a bounce rig or on a drop shot rig, some places call it, are tied on tag ends. Again, these are just triple surgeon's knots. We're leaving the tag ends long enough to tie flies to. The flies get a much more natural drift that way rather than tying eye to eye and bend. That first fly especially gets a much more natural drift. The other way to do this is you can also have this, you could have this fly here tied on the terminal end and have split shot above the flies. Since some places don't allow weights below the flies, you can still fish a dropper rig with weight either between or above the top of the flies. That's one other attachment method, nymph-wise. Another is using a tippet ring. So here in the center, it's hard to tell there, but that's just a tiny little tippet ring. So I actually have 3 knots tied to that ring. Makes an easily replaceable dropper because we have our tippet coming down. We've tied a short dropper off there and a longer dropper off this end. If this gets, I tie this fly and change it a few times and it gets too short to tie to, I just trim it off and tie a fresh tag onto the tippet ring. Pretty straightforward, pretty easy. You can also use this for a 3-fly rig. Attach another tippet ring here, have a tag coming off, and extend another piece up to your main line. Really easy, very workable. Next up, we have a Euro nymphing setup. This is just with 2 flies. Again, you could do 3 flies here, but again, triple surgeon's knot, leaving a tag to our top fly and our point fly down here on the terminal end. You could do this with 3 flies by just adding another tag in here. This is a pretty standard distance for me, somewhere between the flies of, let's say, 18 to 20 inches between the flies. If you keep them really short, they'll both get down a little better, but you'll find that you'll hang up a bit more and you might foul hook fish a bit more often if the flies are too close together. And last but not least, streamers. So the most common way to fish 2 streamers is to tie to the eye of one and to the bend of that first fly and then run your tippet down here. I don't like fishing that way. It doesn't let that top streamer fish and swim very well, so I end up tying them on tags almost all the time. Same thing, triple surgeon's knot. You could also replace this with that tippet ring. There's a few other knots you could do in place of it, but this is the easiest one, I think. That again leaves this to swim a little bit more instead of having rigid tippet and tension on both the butt of the fly and the top of the fly. This is going to swim a lot more natural, and it also allows the fish to get at the fly from most angles. Where if we have tippet tied fore and aft, they have to kind of come right from the side without running into the tippet and knocking the fly out of their way before they get a chance to eat it. This is again abbreviated for the sake of the camera. Normally between my 2 streamers, I would have them no less than 2 feet apart. Most of the time for me, they're 3 to 4 feet apart, and sometimes even as much as 5 feet apart, depending on the situation. In lakes, they tend to be farther apart for me than rivers. Rivers more 3.5, 4 feet. So lots of ways to attach. Most of them are using this triple surgeon's knot. So with that in mind, let's talk about how you make a triple surgeon's knot. It's a really simple knot. You probably already know it. But the most common question we get is, how do I know what to tie to? So hopefully we're going to solve that today by using 2 different colors of material. Let's say that this pink line is my main line, my leader, and the green line is my tippet that I'm adding to the leader. In that case, when I tie this triple surgeons, what's going to happen when I'm done with it, my top fly is going to be tied to this pink piece, and my next fly or my terminal end is going to be the green. So all I'm going to do is take the 2 materials and parallel them, overlap them a bit here. Then I'm going to find the end of the doubled line, which is right here. I'm going to pinch them together in my fingers. I'm going to create a loop, like so. Then because this loop is starting from the bottom, I'm going to create a loop that goes through and over the top, continuing that same direction, and goes through the loop 3 times. So there's once with both the tag and the tippet. Then we're going to go around and go through twice. And then one more time, a 3rd time through to make it a triple surgeons. And then we're going to pull on all 4 tags evenly. It's always best if you moisten the knot. Pull it nice and tight. Next, we're going to trim off this green tag, and we're going to leave the pink because the pink's going to get our our fly. That way we're not pulling against the knot, we're just pulling directly in line with this. So now when we have this as a fly, it's not really pulling into that knot, it's because it's the same line. With my left hand and my right hand are the same line. So when this is fighting a fish, we're not deteriorating that knot. If I use that top tag, it would be pulling that knot apart like this. It doesn't have nearly as much strength that way as it does if you're pulling it in line. So there you see it. We've got this line and this are the same, and then we've added this green line as our tippet or down to our terminal fly. If we're going to fish a 3-fly rig, we would go down and tie another triple surgeons right here, leaving this tag to our second fly, and our terminal end would be our third fly. All right, before we quit here, let's do one more hack, and this is one that is pretty self-explanatory. However, we see often in the shop people are buying lots and lots of tippet rings, and we love that. We love that you support us. We love that you're buying them from us. However, I think a lot of times people are going through their tippet rings really quickly because they're not having them on a swivel. They're not putting the tippet rings on a swivel, or they're not tying to them on the swivel. So most tippet rings come on a swivel for you. If they don't, you want to add them to a swivel or something like it. Here's why. If you pull off one of these tiny little tippet rings, this is a swivel, but on the swivel is 8 or 10 little tippet rings. If I take one of those off and try and hold it in my fingers and then try and thread tippet through it, I'm going to lose 5 or 6 of those before I get the tippet through them. Secondarily, even if I get the tippet through it on my first pass, if I try and hold that tiny little ring in my fingers while I tie a knot, that's fine, I can get to that part, but then when I go to pull that tight, you can't get enough surface area on that ring without it slipping out of your hand. So you can't really cinch up a knot very well holding just the tippet ring. So the hack is this. This is simple. You probably already know this, but in case not, since we talk to people every day that don't know this trick already, we're just going to show it here. What you do is you find the tippet ring that is closest to the exit. This is a snap swivel, so it's got a side that opens. So I find the tippet ring closest to the exit, I separate it from the rest, pass the line through the tippet ring, then tie your knot. Whatever knot you're going to use to tie to it. We're just going to do an unproved clench here for the sake of time. Cinch the knot up and then open the swivel, slide it off, and now you've got your tippet ring attached. Pretty clean, pretty easy. Once it's on something, now I can use this line as leverage to tie another line to it. Now it's not so bad. That's pretty easy. But before, if you were trying to hold just this little ring and try and cinch that up, you just can't grab hold of it. So use those swivels. They come on those for a reason. Half the people that come in looking for tippet rings, we show them these and they say, no, I don't want swivels, I want tippet rings. They're on the swivel for a reason. Use it for leverage. It'll make using the tippet ring that much easier. Go get them. Have fun out there. Stay tuned for more skill builders. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you have comments or suggestions on future skill builders, please leave them in the comment section below.